I'm gonna introduce you to some of the basic terms in what we call critical race theory that really helps people to kind of understand racism in a way that's constructive. So as you know, and this has been a very intense summer. It kind of mirrors summers we've had in our history. I'm thinking about like the summer of 1964, the summer of 67, the summer of 68, where you have, a national uproar. We've had the same thing in 2014 with the murder of Michael Brown. That then went all the way into December with the Eric Garner situation. So we've been here before, but what happened is you had the deaths of 3 African Americans that really it set off a firestorm in this country. Ahmaud Arbery was down in Georgia, Breonna Taylor in Louisville. I teach at Bluefield College, but I also teach graduate school at a school here in Louisville, Kentucky. And so Louisville, Kentucky has been right in the center of this with the Breonna Taylor situation, as well as George Floyd. Major protests erupted all over the country. And I even have a friend who lives in Germany. And the second largest protest Germany has ever had in its history, they had over this summer. They had it this summer. So, I mean, it's a particular kind of moment that we find ourselves in. Here in the city of Louisville, we have found that armed militia groups on both the left and the right have taken to our streets. So in every sense of the word, trying to deny that racism is a problem in America, it's just not, it's not working. It's not going over well. Violence has erupted. We are a country that is on fire. And we're on fire because of issues of race and racism. So it's important to first kind of frame the nature of the problem. And I think to do that, if you just think the problem was with George Floyd and policing, then you don't really understand the real issues. There are gross inequities that a lot of people have been trying to bring to our attention, especially in the areas of wealth and sentencing. And I'll talk a little bit more about wealth a little further into the presentation. But look at the data on sentencing. And what the data will tell you is that the darker your skin, the harsher your sentences are going to be. So wait a minute, if it's the same crime, why if you're black, why is your sentence a little different? There's been about 12 years of what we call backlash ever since the election of Barack Obama. It's ranged from covert microaggressions to, calling the police on African Americans. There's someone who looks suspicious. Oh, I live here. All the way to overt actions. I was teaching at a university in South Carolina during the time Dylan Roof walked into the Mother Emanuel Church, participated in a Bible study, and when everyone bowed their heads to pray at the end, he got up and he murdered. He murdered about 9 people there at the Emanuel Church. And some of the things when he got up and he expressed his reasons for killing Black people, one of the things he said was, Black people are taking over. And so some of that was a bit of backlash from having an African American in the White House. And then there's just been willful blindness and silence by a lot of our white sisters and brothers who have refused to really take a look at what is going on in this nation. And then even when they see it, there's been a reticence to speak up and to speak out that these things are happening. That's really the backdrop to kind of understand what has erupted in this nation in 2020. And it'll be here for the foreseeable future. So what I thought was helpful about my article was that I think in a sense, it really captures the problem we have. We spend so much time talking past or talking at each other instead of talking with one another. It's hard for us to have conversations that are constructive, conversations where mutual understanding occurs, so that then we can do something about the problems. And a major part of the problem is, of course, with our educational system. Now, in Germany, that country has decided to educate its citizens in a way where it tells the truth about its history. So it does not hide what the Germans did with the Holocaust. I mean, it tells the truth about that. It has memorialized it in a way so that the country can go in a different direction. But what we have done here is we have tried to ignore and minimize what has really happened in this country. And so our public school system does not really educate Americans to understand that the foundation is built up on the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of Africans. And this is something that has gone on for centuries. And then when we move beyond slavery, then you had other systems of oppression coming right in behind that. And we're going to explore that. Well, that's not a part of a standard education. You don't get that K through 12. It's not in the gen ed curriculum in our colleges and in our universities. Now, sure, if you want to major in some things, then you'll be able to get some focus and some attention on that. But you can have highly, highly educated white and Black Americans who have no understanding of our history. So when I was pursuing my PhD, and one of the members on my dissertation committee, was an outstanding scholar, but had never read anything by a Black person. Okay, and so here, the topic of my dissertation is dealing with Black issues. He's never even read a book. So I'm having to educate him about these issues so that he can then weigh in on the value and the credibility of my research and my project. And that's nothing new. So it's a problem of our educational system. So when you have this sort of partial history that gets taught in public schools, then it creates a sort of second problem. Well, then you can't fix something unless you understand what it is, how it works, who benefits from it, and who's negatively affected by it. So you see, we can never address the issues of racism because we don't even teach people how we've arrived at this moment in 2020. So what ends up happening is we end up talking past each other. We get into these shouting matches where people are like, well, you're a race baiter, or then they go, well, you're a racist, and that's not constructive. And this sort of gridlock moment that we find ourselves in is why some of what is happening this summer and into the fall, there is some promise that you're starting to have some people who are willing to listen. I also end the essay talking about the difference between mental and moral ignorance. See, mental ignorance is when you just don't know. Okay, you weren't exposed to that in your educational sojourn. But moral ignorance is when people who have different experiences are trying to share their experiences, and their history, they're met with this sort of refusal. That attempts to be obstinate or to delegitimize that experience. And so that's really a deeper kind of moral problem. So this is why Dr. King argued that, America needs a revolution of values. If he was talking about, we were progressing scientifically, but we were not keeping up morally. So as a society, one of the problems to why we talk past each other is because a lot of people, they don't want to know the truth. Because once they know the truth, then that's going to raise some incredibly hard questions for them. which then speaks to why we need to have not only this revolution of values, but we also need a revolution of our imagination. We can imagine better ways to build society than this. So what I want to share is just some 5 things I think that we get wrong, and I'm going to glance over a few, and then I'm gonna park on a couple of these because they're very, very important. It just provides context. It will give you context so that you understand how we got here. Because if you can understand how we got here, then we can begin, I think, to imagine creative ways to go in a different direction. So the 5 things I want to share with you is just basically, people think racism is going away. They think racism is simple. It's racism is a thing of the past. Some want to argue that you can be neutral. I think this is a very important point. I won't be able to spend as much time on it, but I'm going to share a resource with you that I think will really help you to understand that. And also that racism is not a workplace issue. I do want to caution you, friends, from thinking that, well, you know, we don't deal with that in the healthcare field. I think you're going to find in every field, racism is a problem. And I'll kind of show you some ways that it intersects with some of the work that you are doing. So let's get started. There is this kind of mythology in this country where people believe that somehow racism is going away. And one of the ways we try to minimize the presence and the power of racism is, you know, we'll get a little learning. And one of the things you'll learn in critical race theory is that race is a social construct. Okay, there was a time people did not believe in different races. All right. So you can trace the idea of race to the Middle Ages. It's very, very important. They needed some kind of way to rationalize and justify colonialism, which is going to be Europeans going into places where there are Black and brown bodies and tremendous resources. They're going to take advantage of these people. They're going to exploit these people. And so what race does is race became the ideology they could use to justify what they were going to do. So they were like, oh, there are all these different races. So what some people try to do is they say, well, look, race isn't real. We're humans. At the genetic level, there are no differences in the races. So since race is a social construct, then there's no need to pay attention to racism. Well, that minimizes how it has functioned in history. Many believe when Barack Obama became president of the United States that we were in a post-racial era. So America was beyond racism because we had an African-American in the White House. Some want to argue, well, hey, it'll just go away if people stop talking about it. Now, that's very naive. It's very naive to think that something that has functioned for hundreds of years will vanish and disappear if we somehow not talk about it. So I want to just encourage you to maybe look at the article that's there on the slide, because I think it's very, very helpful. There is this narrative of optimism in America, and I think it's an important part of who we are. But sometimes you have to balance optimism with realism, because if you become too optimistic and not realistic, then you can't deal with the problems that are there. And so there is this mythology of racial progress that's very much a part of some of these problems, which is exactly why when I explained this sort of undercurrent that brought us to this moment, these are the things we refuse to really face, because we've been trying to delude ourselves into thinking that things are much better off than they actually are. I do want to just share this resource with you. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but it's an incredibly important resource. And to use a cooking analogy, racism is baked into the cake of America. So once you get, your eggs, your flour, your vanilla, all that stuff you put in there, that's about the extent I know of cooking because I'm not good at baking. I can do crock pot stuff. But once you mix all that stuff together, you put it in the oven and it comes out as the cake. Well, you can't pull the eggs out then. And so what Bell is arguing is that the very foundation of this country was built on certain people on this quest for freedom while denying those same freedoms to other people. So racism is baked in the cake. So the only way to really deal with it is not by denying that it's there, it's baked into it. So we have to begin to explore, well, then what do we do since the cake has been put together this way? Instead of trying to pretend, well, there are no eggs in this cake. Of course there's eggs in the cake. So racism is a part of the fabric of this country. You can't be talking about freedom for some people while enslaving other people, and then all that follows that's a part of the foundation. So what Bell argues is that, man, racism is going to always be here. And it's not an act of submission, but it's an act of defiance. So in other words, it's saying this will always be the problem. So we need to proceed understanding that this is the problem instead of thinking it's something you can easily solve. Which takes me to my second point. Some people think racism is simple. This quote comes from the article I shared with you. Racism it's not studied in public schools and colleges, yet it is spoken often in public spaces and in our political discourse. And a lot of these conversations, they're often uninformed opinions. Okay, it's too much of, well, in my opinion, instead of really grounding your understanding of racism in the careful study of history and the various domains of knowledge or disciplines that give racism context and meaning. So this is exactly why conversations around race, they just become shouting matches. I mean, social media is just on fire with this kind of stuff, where people are just back and forth. This kind of approach to dialogue just leaves people with resentment, confusion, and sometimes it leads to violence because we're talking past one another. If you want to have conversations about racism, then you have to move beyond naive assumptions that, oh, it's going away, or that you can just kind of give your opinion about something and that's the be all end all to something as incredibly complex as racism. I've spent the better part of 15 years studying this stuff. So if you want to get a good handle on racism, then you're going to need to do a lot of history. You need to go all the way back, at least to the Middle Ages, to understand the whole inception of the idea of the different races, and then how it plays out in Europe, how it plays out in Asia, how it plays out in Africa, how it plays out in the Americas. That's a lot of history. And then you'll need to give real careful attention to what happens in our North American context. And then if you really want to understand slavery, then you'll also, and this is what I had to do in my dissertation, you need to study how slavery functioned in antiquity, in different historical periods, because there are similarities and there are differences. It's not always the same thing. Well, then there's also a psychological component to this. Humans have a problem with bias and prejudice. That's kind of a human problem. But so you kind of need to understand some of the psychological dimensions to that, because people are just too quick to think, well, I'm not biased. We all have biases. We all have them. Then you need to also understand aspects of socialization. What happens when people get together in groups, when they classify themselves, when they decide who gets resources, who has power, who decides the laws, then that's all a part of understanding racism as well. And then there is this spiritual, this religious dimension when you have powerful countries and governments and leaders who need the resources of religion to provide legitimacy to it, to justify it. God's for slavery. God came up with the idea of the racists. God says the racists shouldn't mix. So they'll come up with these things. So religion even becomes a part of the problem. So what I'm trying to say is there's an incredible amount of complexity if you want to understand how we got here. And I'm always thankful for people's opinions, but what I'm trying to help people to do is you've got to move beyond ethnocentrism. Your opinions and your experiences, they're not the center of everything. There are other people who have other experiences and other histories and that we need to consider so we can build a society where everyone can thrive. One of the biggest problems we have while people talk past each other, while they sometimes oversimplify or misunderstand racism, is because they don't understand the difference between prejudice and racism. See, prejudice are just making generalizations about other groups. But racism is not the same as prejudice. And a lot of times people think, well, I'm not prejudiced. And a lot of white people, they aren't prejudiced. So why y'all keep talking about racism? Because racism is structural. Racism is the system. In David Wellman's book, Portraits of White Racism, this is a standard. This is a classic text that has been written in critical race theory. He says you really understand racial consciousness when you analyze it in relation to the organization of advantage rather than the structure of personality. So in other words, stop thinking racism is a bunch of people are prejudiced. No, racism is a structural relationship based on the subordination of one racial group by another. So the determining feature of race relations is not prejudice, but it's the superior position of whites and their attendant institutions. A third myth is we try to historicize racism. Oh, it's just something that happened, back in the 1800s. People want to be quick to say, well, slavery ended in 1865. Why are you still talking about racism in 2020? My family did not own slaves. So that reflects a profound misunderstanding, not only of racism, but you really don't understand what slavery was in the first place. So to do that, I would encourage you to look at Ira Berlin's book, Generations of Captivity, where he really exposes what slavery was about. It's not just about shaming and brutalizing Africans. It's not just about the whip. It's not just about the rapes and just the sheer violence of it. But what slavery was really about, it was about using mass cheap, as in free labor, to make another class wealthy. So slavery was about the money. Now, before cotton became king, America was not a world power. But when Eli Whitney created that cotton gin and they started pumping out that cotton, America became the second largest empire behind Britain. And it was able to do that because of slavery. They were completely disenfranchising Africans. And then so then slavery is deemed unconstitutional, but then it gets followed by well over another 100 years of legal disenfranchisement. I'm not talking about these are small groups of people doing things against pockets of African Americans. I'm talking about it was legal to do all these things to African Americans. So you get the black codes, which predated Jim Crow segregation. With these various laws that were developed in the South to control what blacks could do. And often if you broke one of these codes, they would arrest you and basically re-enslave you. It's called convict leasing. It was going on all the way up through the Second World War period, where they were basically working for free. And I'm not talking about these are legitimate crimes. It can be anything. If you didn't have a job, they would just arrest you and send you to a prison camp. If you were accused of something, they would arrest you, send you to a prison camp, and you were working for some wealthy white corporation, business, and even sometimes you were working for the state. So in the same ways black labor was producing wealth in slavery, it was doing the exact same thing even into the 20th century. You get the system of Jim Crow, separate but equal, and the equal is a joke. It was not equal. African Americans were being lynched in the thousands. These lynchings were being attended by tens of thousands of whites. These were public gatherings, festivals. So white people who are alive today, your relatives attended some of these lynchings. There was one lynching in Waco, Texas. There was over 10,000 people there. They created postcards. They would sell these postcards, memorabilia. They would announce lynchings in the newspaper, and people would show up for these things. That's state terrorism, and it was legal to do that. More recently, you have redlining, where we have basically created a separate housing. So you have these slums, and then mass incarceration. So more African Americans are part of the prison system than were enslaved. But yet we think we've really moved beyond some of these vicious systems of the past. If I was alive during slavery, I would have stood up against that system. Well, what are you doing today with the system of mass incarceration? You're talking about a small swath of the population, 13% of the population, yet it's making up a huge percentage of the prison population. It's not that African Americans are more deviant than anyone else. There are deeper problems there. So if you're going to understand racism, it has these dual aspects. There's dehumanization, but then there's economic exploitation. And when that happens, it creates systems of advantage and disadvantage. And that's what has brought us to this moment. Racism creates gaps and inequities. So this graphic is just one way to kind of understand, like the Kerner report came out in the late 60s and said that if we don't deal with racism, you're going to end up with two Americas. And Martin Luther King Jr. gave a great speech at Stanford University on the two Americas. You ought to look that up on YouTube, or look up this unequal opportunity race video. And it just helps you to understand why when you look at every measure, whether it's education, healthcare, whether it's the criminal justice system, there's this huge gap between white and black Americans. And how do you explain the gap? Well, you explain the gap with the history. You explain the gap with there were policies that created this. Policies like the Homestead Act that gave acres and acres of land to white Americans. You know, if you're going to build wealth, you need to have land. And the federal government gave white people land and did not give African Americans that land. And then what you do is you can trace the descendants of the Homestead Act that are alive today. And they can trace their upward mobility, their home ownership, their class status to one policy that excluded African Americans. You can do the same thing with the New Deal, same thing with VA loans and the GI Bill. These are all things the federal government did. They were racist policies because they were providing advantages for one group and would not provide those same advantages and opportunities for another group. So that's why you get gaps. That's why you get people who have a head start, who have an advantage. So this book, the American Non-Dilemma, you should check this book out. She talks about how you can have racial inequality without racism. And I think it's just a great quote that she shares here. It basically says, you don't have to be racist in order to enjoy racial advantage. That's America. The reason racial inequality persists is basically people within a group, they share opportunities with people who are like them. So this definition of maybe racism as opportunity hoarding, I think that's constructive and helpful. So when you get policies that's providing opportunities for one group that's not providing those same opportunities for others, well, this is how you can have the baby boom generation passing on $9 trillion in wealth to their descendants. Wait a minute, if everyone's supposed to earn their way and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, then why are we passing on wealth from one generation to another? And then want to claim that somehow you're earning this. That logic makes no sense. Okay. So one group has trillions of dollars to pass on, another group does not. So the data on wealth is alarming. White Americans make up about 60% of the population. They own 90% of the wealth. How does 60% of the population own 90% of the wealth? Are they that smart? Do they work that hard? No. The system has benefited them. It's given them a head start. Black families own $5 in wealth for every $100 white families have. This is why we are where we are. The fourth myth is that you can be neutral. Nothing gets people more worked up, especially progressive whites, than that word racist. I'm not a racist. So reading Ibram Kendi's book about being an anti-racist, this is such a helpful book, because what he is doing is he is really reframing how we understand where we stand as it relates to problems of structural racism. This quote where he says the opposite of racist is not racist. It is anti-racist. So if you want to be on the right side of history, you want to be on the right side of an issue, you have to move beyond trying to be neutral. You have to move beyond saying, I'm not racist. The real question is, are you anti-racist? Because you're either trying to dismantle this system, or you're trying to be complicit and continue to benefit from the system. You either allow the system to continue to run its course, or you start working to oppose this system and to get policies in place that correct things that have been done. There's no in-between safe space of not racist. You're either racist or you're anti-racist. And what we need allies doing anti-racist work, not people who are just wanting to be neutral and say, well, I have black friends, or I like black people. I don't have any problem with black people. Oh, that's great. That's great. But are you going to be on our side when we start introducing policies and pieces of legislation that's going to correct these things that have been done? Are you going to go into the voting booth and you're going to vote interests beyond yourself? That's being anti-racist. And the fifth thing that we get wrong is we think that somehow it's not in the workplace. I think racism is very much a part of all professions, because discrimination, it is there. Especially when you start looking into corporate culture. Look at the data on health inequities for Black Americans. This is nothing new to you all. You all know this. But the President Clinton commissioned a major study on race at the turn of the century. And the report came back and said that Black Americans fare worse than any other group. Higher rates of homicide, HIV. We have highest rates of hypertension, depression. You know what the data says about obesity. But then it says on average, white Americans have better access to the social and economic resources necessary for healthy environments and lifestyles, and better access to preventative medical services. There are major Black communities where there are no grocery stores, there are nothing but convenience stores, fast food restaurants, no places where they can get fruits and vegetables. Then you wonder why you're having these kinds of health problems, because of the inequities. You hear what the data is saying about the impact of COVID on the Black community. One study says that Black people are infected at nearly 3 times the rate of white Americans. If you look at the number of physicians, if white Americans are 60% of the population, look, it's pretty comparable in the number of white physicians, 56.2%. But how do you explain 13% and technically 13.4% of the population having 5% of the physicians? Because there are deeper structural reasons for this. So racism in a lot of different ways intersects with the work that you do. So now I'd love to spend some time discussing some of these things with you. I did a great job ending on time. I do this all the time, so I'm pretty good at rolling through those slides. What questions do you have? Questions, observations?
Hi, my name is Denise Cornegay and I'm from Georgia. And we had a wonderful panel yesterday where we were talking about race in our state with our medical students. And one of the issues that came up was one of our students who was down in Brunswick, Georgia, a Black female, was talking about how she would go running every morning in the neighborhood around the hospital, and that was just what she did. And then we had the murder of a young Black man out jogging in that neighborhood. And she talked about how fearful she became and that she was very aware it could have been her at any point in time. My question is, what is the best way for us to support our students, to offer them support, not in a way of, I'm going to take care of you, but how do we open up and let them know that we're here, that we're going to listen, and that they don't need to hide that fear, that there's not repercussions. Let us help where we can, or help you figure out. How do we do this? And I'm ashamed to say that I don't think any of us thought about talking to our students who were down there about whether they were feeling fear. And that's poor on our part. I mean, that's the first lesson I learned.
Yeah, and I think that's an important lesson. And even the way you frame the question, what's helpful about it is that you're already thinking about what you can do, to be a better ally, to provide a space where all students can thrive. And so it's just a matter of finding some ways through personal or professional relationships to let people know that you are there for them. I think that's important. I think it's also important from a structural standpoint to create mechanisms so that students who have a similar kind of history and experience, they can kind of network and kind of share their experiences, in a safe space. So this is why when I work for a lot of predominantly white institutions, I've just done a lot of work in starting either a Black Studies program or some kind of Black Student Alliance, so that they have space to kind of talk about how they are experiencing being in basically in white space, because the model since desegregation and integration has been Blacks coming into white space. White people do not hardly come into Black space. So Black people have to learn how to adjust themselves and trying to learn what are the rules, what can I do, what cannot do, and well, somebody said something to me, and what do you think about that? So providing some kind of programmatic or support structures, that's good as well. And then also working, I think when it comes to this problem with policing, more educational institutions are going to have to do some things to connect local police with schools and hospitals and things, so that relationships can be built and you can kind of get to know people. Because I deal with the same fear. I live in a predominantly white area, and I love exercising and walking all the time. And when I see police officers coming by, I mean, I am terrified. I'm not gonna lie. I'm very, very scared that somebody has picked up the phone and says there's someone who looks suspicious, even though I live here and I walk all the time, that I could be the next one. And so the more jobs we can do, sort of brokering some partnerships and building some kind of awareness so that they know some of these officers and officers kind of get to know them, I think that would be helpful as well.
I just want to add one more comment. One of the things that came out from the student panel part of our day yesterday was there has been an alliance, if you will, of Black students who have created their space.
Good.
And I'm not sure it's good in the sense of, and here's what I'm struggling to process everything. What we heard in that group, in the presentations yesterday, is that a lot of our Black students felt angry that they had to create a Black space for this. A lot of the white students talked about how we're not involved in any of this, we don't understand it, and we're never going to understand it if you exclude us from this. And so there was a sense of, from the students, it's very interesting because we had a faculty panel too. The students didn't want segregated spaces. They wanted everybody to live in the same space and recognize that experiences are different. The faculty felt very strongly that we needed a Black faculty association or a Black student association. And there seems to be a generational change in what the demands are. And I actually kind of connected with what the students were saying about this should be all of our shared experiences, because if we go to a safe space where we don't talk about this with everyone, then there's a reason everyone doesn't understand. So there's something there. I'm not sure what it is.
Yeah.
But I was really intrigued just listening as the students talked about their experiences and their default coping mechanisms versus their desired coping mechanisms.
Yeah. No, I think that's very helpful. I would just tend to encourage people to always take a both and approach, because a lot of times when I've been in these universities and we've started these groups, then white students, their retort is that, we're feeling excluded. But again, it's just important that whether they choose to take advantage of that space, that at least that space is there. Because there are some times when it's hard to interpret certain things to people who don't understand that experience. And sometimes just being in a space where you don't have to do all of that sort of explanatory interpretive work, I get that. But then also having spaces where you can still have those conversations and you get that engagement that goes across lines of race. And then my pushback is also to some of my white brothers and sisters is, why do they always feel when it's Black space that they're not invited? Because Black people have been coming into what everyone calls normative space is white space. And when it comes to Black space, sometimes whites are always feeling like, I don't get invited to that. You can come to Black churches, Black schools, the fact that we have HBCUs doesn't mean white people can't go to those schools. Is that these are mechanisms in place to help people ward off the onslaught of racism. Great question.
This is Sandra Pope from West Virginia. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I love where you made the point that you can't fix what you're not willing to face. That is just something that is so true. I want to ask you if you can say a little bit more about neutrality in racism, maybe give a few examples or how you can deal with that a little on a personal basis.
Yeah, so what I tried to show in the presentation is when you think about racism and how it has created structural gaps and structural inequities, then the only way to correct those, it's going to take policies and laws, because policies and laws created the problem. You're never going to fix the problem by creating just goodwill among our white sisters and brothers. We have to create policies and laws that are specific and are going to address specific things that have disenfranchised Blacks. And we can point specifically to laws and policies backed by the federal, state, and local governments that has created these problems. So the reason we say you can't be neutral is when it's time to, we need whites who will help and join us in the work of developing, doing this kind of public policy, legal work, lobbying Congress, passing laws, voting for candidates who are going to push these things. That's what we're talking about. You can't just say, well, I don't have anything against Black people, but now we're trying to launch this movement that's going to begin a process, and we're not going to do it in our generation. We're not going to close this gap and make and have real equality in our lifetime. But what kind of steps can we take from a strategic standpoint to begin the process of correcting some of these things? And so that's what being an ally, doing sort of anti-racist work, it means you are actively trying to do very, very specific things to correct the problem and not be on the sidelines or not be claiming that you're neutral by basically saying, I don't have anything against Black people. And again, that's great, but what we need people who want to fight and help us to actively correct things that have been done. Great question, Sandra, thank you.
Hi, I had a question kind of following up on Ms. Denise's in regards to students creating Black spaces. I'm a physician assistant student at Shenandoah University, and we're actually in the process of creating a space amongst the different health professions, pharmacy, PT, occupational therapy, and things like that. And we presented it to the administration. Well, they found out about it as we were in the process of creating it, and they were actually pretty excited about it, but they gave us the question of how can they help us, or how can they assist us in the formation and the development of such an organization or a space. And I was just asking, I know maybe some financial reasons, some financial, ways to help out. But other than that, I just wanted to get your thoughts on, from an administrative standpoint, how can they help us solidify the space and organization to be productive and fruitful?
Yeah, I think great question, and I definitely want to commend you, on that very, very important work of just thinking about it from a programmatic standpoint. So yes, there's the allocation of funds so that you can do these kinds of things, but I think also space, and then from that program, it's educational forums. It's also sort of, social functions, social activities. And again, when these students are doing these kinds of things, they should be open to the community, and people who aren't a part of the sort of, that Black group should understand that we need allies who want to come in there and who value and think that it's important to have that space, and they want to be an ally, and they want to be a friend, and they want to be a partner. And so, if it's something social where, a Black film is being shown, spoken word, or whether you're talking about something that's specific to the profession that affects the Black community. Having white allies in that space as well, trying to understand those issues and listening to their Black brothers and sisters talking about those things, that's going to benefit them when they go, into their various fields of work. And so having these kinds of groups is only going to enrich these programs more broadly, and I think give people certain values and skills they'll need to excel in a diverse 21st century workplace.
Very quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly, we have a couple of questions in the chat that I'd like to pose to you. Susan Stewart asked, what is a good way for whites to engage in a difficult conversation with people of color? And then I have one other question very quickly, if you could address that one.
Whew, that's a pretty tough question. Well, I think it's important that whites are willing to listen, and I think that's the best lead in to these kind of hard conversations, where you just let people know that you are here to listen, because that's such an important step in moving beyond ethnocentrism and really moving beyond thinking your experience is the center. Which is why I'm kind of excited about this moment in which we find ourselves, and the webinars that I get to do is because I'm seeing there are people who are willing to do some listening. So listening is important, and what may help you going into those conversations is maybe to read some of these resources that I shared with you, so that maybe you can ask how they've experienced these things, and maybe how, that you're willing to do your homework, and I didn't know that these things happen, that can be something that's very, very helpful to do.
Okay, we have another question from Locke Edinger. Are there resources available to help white individuals understand and acknowledge their white privilege? Yes, there are, and I would be glad to actually share a list of resources, and I'll send those to you, Angela. But I encourage all people to read books like Why Do All Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria? I think that's a that's an excellent book. The book White Fragility is a bestseller. Reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow really helps you to understand the whole issue of mass incarceration and how it affects Black Americans. And so I'll share those resources, as well as the book The Hidden Cost of Being African American. That was on the presentation, that really helps you to understand how, even though Blacks have made progress from an income standpoint, Black people have no wealth. So they're always in a very socially precarious situation. Did we lose her?
Dr. Brogdon, we may have lost Angela. Are there any more questions? All right, Dr. Thomas, are you still here? Do you have any comments?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm Sharon Holmes, and I'm in East Central Missouri, AHEC. That's the St. Louis area. My question is, we are doing a lot of work with diversity, and we work with other minority. Well, I don't really like the term minorities, but minorities. Now, how do we've been saying white and Black, but this is a very pluralistic society now. So how do we work with other minorities? Because there are distinct prejudices / racism that affects them also.
Mm-hmm.
So just a question on how we form, how we allow them to be allies, and then with us, and then how we are allies with them?
Great question. I think it's very, very important. There is something very limited about the sort of binary way we talk about race in America as black and white. That we have to understand diversity goes beyond that. And I think it is important to acknowledge that, to recognize that, and to find some specific ways to broaden our conceptualization of racial and cultural diversity. So I think that's very, very important because, of course, our Latino sisters and brothers, man, they're facing similar challenges to what the African American community has faced and the broader immigrant community. They're experiencing some similar challenges. And there's something about when you are a victim of racism and you're trying to survive the onslaught of racism, that sometimes it's hard to be a good ally to others because you're in survival mode yourself. So it's important to kind of name that. And I do want to also sometimes push back because what other groups are good at doing is always changing the subject when we're trying to focus on addressing very specific issues that come out of this history that the country refuses to acknowledge and refuses to fix. And we can't, and a part of facing the problem means people who are in other communities, they need to join us in this fight to do some specific things because other groups have been getting specific pieces of legislation passed in Congress. And we've had HR 40, which just introduces a bill to study reparations. And it has gone before Congress for 30 years and it can't even get a hearing. So if it's something that's a national policy or a national piece of legislation that's focused on the Black community, it's always met with resistance or with deflection. And so what we need people who aren't going to change the subject and say, well, we also need to worry about yes, we can do that. But what we're trying to focus on right now is this policing problem, or what we're trying to focus on right now are, discrimination in hiring. And can you join us in that work? And when we get something specific passed, then let's join you in your work. Why does it have to always be the Black community that we're always putting our sort of political and social agenda items on the back burner, and others are getting policies and agendas passed? In our community, we're on the way. We have the same wealth that we had when we came out of slavery as a people. So we made no progress. Home ownership rates are where they were during the Great Depression. So we are a community, we're facing genocide, and we need partners who are gonna help prevent that. Great question.
Like there's another question in the chat from Christy Zachary. Black people and minorities living in rural America have some very distinguishable challenges. Some information on that would be helpful.
No, I totally agree. I'll check and kind of see what kind of resources I have and some, if I can find some studies I'd love to share. I've got folders and folders of research on this stuff. And I will admit, a lot of the data and research, the focus is really on African Americans in these urban centers, but the dynamics are a little different in rural areas. And I grew up I'm a product of small town America, even though now I live in the city. So the dynamics are a little different. And I think what research in Black studies and critical race theory, I think they're starting to see that and are trying to catch up to it. But I'll see if I can find something on that, and I'll let you know. If I do, I'll pass that on to Angela.
All right. I'm not sure if there are any more questions. Dr. Thomas, Angela, you guys want to close out the meeting?
Okay, well, this is Dr. Thomas again, and I just want to really thank our presenter, still morning here, I'm in Louisiana, for really tackling a very difficult subject. I'm a practicing physician, and so many things that you said resonated with me, and the question that was raised about how African American students tend to congregate with one another and support one another and group together as they go through this rigorous academic process of becoming a physician. It just brought back so many memories of my medical school training and just different ways that we do feel about needing one another to survive in a greater academic community. So that was really powerful. And oftentimes when we tackle racism and we tackle prejudice, we talk around it because it makes people uncomfortable, but you challenging us today to be uncomfortable and to look at ourselves and as well as others and try to be solution driven, knowledge based. I thought it was just very powerful, and thank you so much for presenting to us today.
You're very welcome. It was an honor.
Thank you, Dr. Brogdon, and thanks to all the attendees for engaging in today's webinar, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, friends.
Thank you.
Thank you.